But what I want to say at the start of our conversation is that, to echo Anel, that we really have a wonderful group of speakers who have engaged with Hannah Arendt herself. And we are drawing from some of the conversations, the global scholarly debates on issues related to violence, and particularly witnessing the violence as we have been witnessing in Gaza in real time. And the Sudan and the Congo, it's violence that we have not seen before. And this is violence in our own country, gender-based violence, that the stories of violence that we've seen against women's bodies is just at the scale that we have never witnessed before. And the fact that it's happening daily, repeatedly, it's indescribable. Hannah Arendt, the reason we wanted to begin today, Professor Rose is coming tomorrow again for a more public conversation. And we thought to start and invite, because Professor Roodt has engaged with Hannah Arendt, and we know we've had you, Jaco, coming here. You draw in your work from Hannah Arendt. We thought to begin this question on what would Hannah Arendt have said. We are appreciative of these conversations that are happening globally, going back to Hannah Arendt, most notably the book by Lindsay Stonebridge, We Are Free to Change the World. And she begins that book by reminding us about the continuing relevance of Hannah Arendt. It's a great book, and it calls us back to some of the things that Hannah Arendt had said, which in fact she could have said them last week. And so we thought how powerful to use her as a reference point to begin this conversation today. And so we've asked Professor Roodt to kick us off this morning.
So thank you very much for the invitation. Okay, so starting then with what would Hannah Arendt have said, I would imagine that one thing that she would have said, or possibly the first thing, is think for yourselves. The metaphor that she often used is thinking without banisters. Thinking without, if you think of going up and down the stairs, holding onto the handrail to protect you from vertigo, to make you feel safe and secure. And that's the opposite of the kind of thinking that Arendt advocates. And I think that sometimes we use theorists, whether it's Arendt or anyone else, precisely as these kinds of handrails. That we assume that that our own position or our own reasoning, our own views are true or justified or compelling merely because someone else had expressed it. And I don't think that we should use Hannah Arendt like that. As a kind of an authority on whom we rely, or to whom we turn to justify what we want to say and think and express ourselves. So the challenge for me today, and I think I would suggest for all of us, is to reflect on Arendt's views and their relevance for our time without using her as a banister, as a crutch, as a handrail. So what I propose is that we don't treat her as a kind of container of ready-made ideas, but rather as an example, really an exemplar of a kind of practice, of a kind of thinking practice, and a kind of thinking practice that we can undertake for ourselves. So what is this thinking practice, or what are the features of this kind of thinking? And I would like to just highlight two. Thinking, in the way that Arendt understands it, is an inner dialogue with oneself, where one is both the questioner and the one who proposes a provisional answer, which then becomes a source for new questioning. That kind of thinking is a solitary activity. It's something that happens when one withdraws from the world, when one withdraws from others, and when you are with yourself, and you are engaging in this inner questioning and answering, questioning anew. And that's exactly why totalitarian states, fascist states, those are states where they are rallies, marches, crowds, right? All of this being swept up in the crowd, at the rally, at the march, at the protest, it silences thinking. When it's swept up in the mass and loses that inner realm of thought. So that's the one feature, this sort of inner dialogue. And the other feature of this kind of banisterless thinking that Arendt exemplifies is it's unending. It has no natural stopping point, and that makes it dangerous. Not just dangerous for others, but in the first place, dangerous for the thinker. Because if one really doesn't stop asking and questioning one's own assumptions, your own conceptual frameworks and so on, then one can't accept anything as absolutely given. So that's a kind of thinking that is unending, and that even questions, maybe even especially questions, its own operations. So it's a kind of thinking that doesn't leave you with certainty, that doesn't leave you with mastery, that doesn't leave you with finality. And it prevents us, this kind of unending inner dialogue, it prevents us from treating familiar conceptual categories as a kind of a crutch or handrail. It forces us to question the conceptual frameworks within which our own thinking is cast. The task of thinking, as Arendt says it very beautifully in her book on thinking, is the task of thinking is to unfreeze frozen categories, frozen conceptual categories. In fact, I think she quotes Kafka, something along the lines of, the novel is an axe for the frozen sea inside. That's the job of thinking, is to take an axe to the frozen conceptual side. What is the relevance of this kind of thinking, which is exemplified by Arendt for our own time? I'd say, on the one hand, the relevance is that should inspire us not to reduce the particularity of human actions and human events to familiar inherited conceptual categories. To recognize that understanding is not served by calling many different things by the same name. And this happens often. Some people in the room know that this is what I've been working on for some years. This is what happens with violence. That the concept violence can become a kind of a conceptual banister or a handrail that we use unthinking, and where we end up with a tendency to define very different actions, institutions, practices as forms of violence, which has the consequence of us understanding less rather than more of the world with its specificity. The last point, and then I'll stop for now. So what is the political dimension of this kind of thing? What would it mean to think politically in the sense that I've now described? And one aspect of that, which is very strong in Arendt as well, is that the subject of political thinking is not the question, who am I? What do I want? What do I need? Subject of political thinking is the common world that lies between us and that does not coincide with anyone's particular place. It's a kind of thinking that happens in solitude, but that is directed at a common world that is moved by care for the world, rather than exclusively with care for the self. think I'm stopping for now, and I'll.
Thank you for that wonderful opening and very many gems for us to pick and follow. Jaco?
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for coming. You know, I couldn't Vasti have asked for better, you know, sort of prolegomena, I suppose, to what I want to say.
Prolegomena, wow, what a word.
You know, a preface, but much more than a preface, you know. So I really appreciate what you said. So I don't have a title, and I do have to say that I certainly didn't expect at all that I would talk about what I'm going to talk about. But that is the kind of thing that reading Arendt does to you. So my point of departure is from the 1948 preface to the first edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism, where Arendt writes the following. She says, "The essential structure of all civilizations is at the breaking point. It can nowhere provide the guidance to the possibilities of the century or an adequate response to its horrors." Now, the horrors of the century were, of course, by then more or less well observed, and responding to them as a witness would, in Arendt's assured conviction, necessitate the kind of thinking without a banister that, for me at least, came into its own most definitively, most irrevocably, one could say, with the proposition, which was itself the product of a profound witnessing in the most concrete literal sense, which was the proposition of the banality of evil. In the conclusion of Eichmann in Jerusalem, 15 years later. Fast forward more than 40 years to NYU law professor Jeremy Waldron's 2007 New York Review of Books article called "What Would Hannah Say?" And there he observed as follows. Most important, he says, Arendt understood the insidious and non-spectacular aspects of political and moral deterioration. It is here, if at all, you have to say that their concept of the banality of evil comes into its own. Now, in an attempt of my own to take my cue from Arendt and think again, once more, without a banister, as a response to what we have been witnessing for some time now, my sense is that the banality of evil may once have been, but it is decidedly no more non-spectacular. On the contrary, I think that our times are dark, maybe partially, maybe more than simply partially, by the force of a blinding light that conjures a vanishing. And that vanishing is the vanishing of the distinction between spectacular and banal. Not only has the banal been unrelentingly dressing itself in the finery of spectacle for decades now, what may have once been the strictly spectacular has been streaming into what is left of our common sense of reality, to the point that it is now outrightly banal, with us increasingly indifferent, impervious to the spectacle. Greedily exploiting these two dimensions of the breakdown simultaneously, contemporary evil raises its abominable orange head constantly, and its head is vengeful to the hardcore. It is the vengeful hardcore of this spectacular banality of evil that constitutes the distinctive dimension of the horrors of our own century. That leads now me to my second point. Just as the essential structure of all civilizations could not provide an adequate response in Arendt's time to the horrors of the 20th century, It cannot provide guidance to the possibilities of our own. Now, that essential structure, if you are a lawyer, of civilization has always been both founded and grounded in the containment by the law of the otherwise boundless violence that vengeance that is characteristic of the so-called natural state, and that containment by the law. And yet, of course, we know that vengeance, that violence, lurks as the dirty secret of the law's founding. For Nietzsche, who Arendt read, of course, and also cited, the founding subsumption of revenge by the law was an at least ethical abomination, without which modern humanity had become incapable of survival, and it still constitutes everywhere not only the essential structure of civilization, as Arendt called it, but with it, it determines the possibilities of the century, of what is understood, taken for what constitutes possibility. So whether she was taking a cue from Nietzsche or not, the Arendt of the human condition, 10 years after the origins, painstakingly distinguished between vengeance and punishment, interestingly enough. And she mediated that distinction through the introduction of forgiveness as political action. So she writes in The Human Condition that forgiveness is, quote unquote, the exact opposite of vengeance. Not really controversial. But then she goes on to say that punishment is by no means the opposite of forgiveness. And it is only once she has left room for a coextensivity of punishment and forgiveness that Arendt's meditation proceeds to impose what she calls the structural element of punishment upon forgiveness in the realm of human affairs, writing famously that the offenses of radical evil transcend the realm of human affairs and the potentialities of human power, and are therefore neither humanly punishable or humanly forgivable, strictly a matter for the gods. So that brings me to the question, against myself in many ways, but here it is. What if, and in full recognition that the gods are dead now and will not be resurrected, let alone make their way again to the realm of human affairs, we are to take our cue from Arendt's expansive thought on punishment, and at the same time also leave the banister behind and take our leave from her by thinking a new beginning for forgiveness. A forgiveness and a new beginning for it that has already been thought, and is perhaps nothing that I say is new in that way. But a forgiveness, a new beginning for forgiveness, that remains ultimately true to Arendt herself. What if the pervasive spectacularity of the banality of radical evil now newly demands what Arendt had called later in The Human Condition a miracle that saves the world? A miracle strictly worldly, grounded in the most worldly fact of all, the natality that belongs to every human being. What if the only option that may be left to displace, to disrupt, to interrupt the seemingly endless cycle of boundless yet somehow still lawful violence in which the world is up to its neck is a gracious unbinding of forgiveness from the secular limit of the ability to punish? It should go without saying that the spectacular banality of contemporary evil is not just going to be most probably humanly unpunishable. It is also now clearly increasingly circumventing already, or just simply ignoring disdainfully, any attempt to restrain it legally. There is a difference which makes a huge difference between worldly forgiveness unbound and divine unconditional forgiveness of the Abrahamic religions. Nothing militates conceptually against the forgiveness of a perpetrator in the same breath as holding them strictly responsible in the worldly sense, yet in a way that does not simply collapse the laws of worldly responsibility into those of traditional forms of punishment. What then if we were to conceive the enormous responsibility which remains for the impossible reparation of these consequences, no longer from within the cognitive range of the human ability to punish, but rather from within the cognitive range of political action, strictly coextensive with that of a still all too human unbounded forgiveness? If the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission taught the world anything, it is that forgiveness without reparation is not only a disastrously short-lived political affair, it is an ethical and political travesty of justice. It was Melanie Klein who not only taught the world that reparation makes hope, but who thereby most clearly revealed the productive, generative, and creative aspect of reparation as a responsibility for destruction going well beyond the ancient lex talionis. This aspect is being presently more or less deliberately obscured by late modern discursive ruses that are quick to cast reparation with the dye of somehow undue punishment when the proponents are vanquished, as in post-apartheid South Africa, at least to a certain extent. And yet, when the boot is on the other foot by force of the twists and turns of history in the form of the victor's law, they loudly insist on and violently enact by force of this law ever more vengeful punishment, now also ever more disproportionate. Against the backdrop of their decidedly dubious track record in human history, I really cannot see how the continuation of these discourses of ressentiment as the vengeful, violent law of punishment still somehow retain a redemptive potential that renders them as though by force of magic capable of putting an end to the diabolical cycle of what Gillian Rose famously called the endless dying of life under tyranny. Thank you.
Jaco, for that expansion of beyond Arendt to other contemporary issues that are also urgent. The beauty of Arendt is that she really calls us to act with urgency, to be critical and to act with urgency. And so your expansion, both of you, calling us to engage thoughtfully and return to that idea of thinking and thoughtfulness that she advocated, to taking it to the level of theoretically beyond her work. What I find interesting with both what you Vasti, and you are saying is this idea of the importance of thoughtfulness, how through the Eichmann in Jerusalem that you are citing, Hannah Arendt came to this point of thinking about the banality of evil. And I wonder, when was the transition from, or was there a transition from the thinking about radical evil that's unforgivable or that's not capable to be punished, unpunishable, to the banality of evil? Can you say something about that?
Yes, so in Arendt's own trajectory, yes, there was a transition. So, I mean, she was deeply steeped in Kant, and she was deeply steeped in the work of Aquinas and so on. And there, the idea of radical evil, the sort of religious notion, how do we deal with this, with the devil that takes root in us, and Kant translated that into a philosophical question. And Arendt grappled with that for a big part of the early part of her intellectual career. And it was being confronted with Eichmann that made her realize, but here you do not have I think her example, which also says something about her as a person, her example of a radical evil is Shakespeare's Richard III, who walks around saying, I must a villain prove. And here's Eichmann. He's not Richard III. He's a little man with his glasses who spent his life behind a desk. That's not a villain in the Shakespearean sense. This is not radical evil. This is the opposite. And how do we make sense of that? And her answer is, well, what characterizes the banal form of evil, the Eichmann version, is thoughtlessness.
Is what?
Thoughtlessness. That's exactly so. So evil springs from thoughtlessness. And I mean, you now said the word orange, and I know where we are, but it's sometimes, well, it often strikes me, it's really a fascinating thing about Donald Trump. I think he has no inner dialogue at all. It's like there are words that are expressed, and then new words are expressed, and there's sort of some inner churning. But it's hard to get a sense of someone who sits and thinks, okay, this is not what I believe. Is it true? Is this the right way to do it? Should I reflect on it? Should I do something else? So what Arendt means by thinking is much more involved in that. But that's sort of the starting point of an inner dialogue. It's not right. And Eichmann was the same. All that he could report was there were orders, I followed the orders. There was nothing of should I follow the orders. That second reflection on your own was absent.
I think you're itching to say something.
Yes, it's just that didn't Arendt end up having, in her exchange with Gershom Scholem, a disagreement about radical and evil, where at one point she says there's no such thing as radical evil because evil has no roots. Only the good has roots. I won't say only the good has an unconscious. But I think there is a sense in which she comes down on the side. I mean, I'm going to talk a bit later about her row and her fight with Scholem over these issues. But I think she ends up repudiating the idea of radical evil altogether.
You're right.
On the other hand, I'll just add this. There are a lot of people who contest her reading of Eichmann. I say there are a lot of people who say he was inspired with anti-Semitism in a way she doesn't allow for adequately. And the mystical components of totalitarian anti-Semitism he was implicated in much more than Arendt allowed, and it seems quite plausible to me. But I don't see why you can't just say both. I don't think you have to choose on this. You can use determination where one thing comes from more than one source, and the concept of banality of evil has germinated so much thinking. I'm not suggesting we should get rid of it, but I think it might need a little bit of refining.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it was for me at least. I think there is we have to acknowledge the link between Arendt's witnessing of the trial and the representation that she sort of gleaned from of Eichmann from the trial, and the arrival at the concept of the banality of evil, because I think there's a really important link between that witnessing and how it impacted upon her thoughts. So yes, but I also think that perhaps the core that Arendt wanted us to take away from the banality of evil was perhaps not so much the banality, but the thoughtlessness, which is really what got to her in the most enduring way, I would say. And now, coming back to the now and what she would have said of the now, thoughtlessness has almost acquired the characteristics of a commodity. It is increasingly, thoughtlessness is something that that is traded upon and with in many ways, and one can talk about things like Twitter, social media, more broadly. But there is a real sense in which thoughtlessness is not only pervasive, but it is increasingly visible. It is increasingly for those who are bearing or trying to bear witness. The witnessing is very much a witnessing, for me at least, of a kind of a dissemination across the political and social field of thoughtlessness.
At the same time, I mean, you then moved into examples from the Truth Commission that seem to contradict Arendt's point of view about the impossibility of certain responses to this radical evil or banality of evil, and how history actually have now shown us that she may have been wrong. In fact, Elizabeth Young Bruhl, her other biography in The Life of the World, For the Love of the World, she does say that Hannah Arendt may have been wrong in saying that forgiveness is impossible, that is only limited to transgressions, political transgressions. And where does that put us now? I mean, it brings us to the point you are making, that not to use her as a crush, not to use her like as a truism, but rather to engage with her, including to be critical of her, because now we know that for whatever it's worth, that those acts of forgiving, those kinds of responses are actually still possible. She was right, of course, in saying that they may not be punishable, because what are the limits of, how much do you punish? Killing 5, 10, 20 people. Yeah. But the act, the response that she says, she kind of put boundaries.
Yeah, and I suppose I was thinking constantly of your work, on precisely this point about forgiveness beyond Hannah Arendt, is I think what the title was of the piece that you published in 2008, I think. And so, yes, of course, I feel a certain ambivalence, but I don't see what else, I suppose, we have. In terms of the possibilities for the interruption of violence, counter-violence, revenge, counter-revenge, and so it goes.
I think Yerushalmi says something rather wonderful about this conundrum, the Hebrew scholar who wrote an amazing book called Analysis, Judaism, Terminable and Interminable. And he said maybe the opposite of forgetting is not memory, it is justice. And it seems to me that goes straight to the heart of, because you're struggling, Jaco, with the idea of forgiveness here, because the TRC, as you say, is the most incredible manifestation of the failure or the partiality or the inadequacy of forgiveness in relationship to a just dispensation. And I think I'm right, and Pumla will correct me, that in the last few weeks, Nomondo Coletta, one of her sons, has taken the government to court, has sued the government over lack of reparations for the death of his father, one of the Craddock Four. I think I've got that. I may have got some of the figures muddled up. And it's the first time I've read anything where there's actually been a legal halt to what the TRC thought it might be able to do. Have I remembered that right?
At the same time, but please,
yeah. So maybe, there's perhaps a bit more nuance, or maybe I would like to think that there might be a bit more nuance to the forgiveness punishment argument on our side. So, where I read it is saying we can only forgive. I mean, the possibility of forgiveness is only there if we know how to punish. Doesn't mean once we have punished, then we can forgive. But the possibility of forgiveness depends on the transgression being conceivable at a human level, and that's why genocide is not forgivable, because it cannot be punished.
It's beyond our imagination.
It's beyond our imagination. So the TRC was different because it was possible to punish. There was a decision not to, and one can have discussions about that. But there were conditions and so on involved in that. But were there to be forgiveness, that was insofar as it was terrible deeds, but still on a punishable scale, versus genocide, which exceeds our capacity to punish. That's what possibly she would say. You might still.
But isn't that a contradiction? Oh, well, not quite a contradiction, but she also says we have to find a way to live together. And so this idea of how do we find a way to live? If we're living together, it's okay. There's genocide. There is the impossible. It's beyond what is punishable. It's beyond the humanly possible. But in the final analysis of things, we have to find a way to live together. And how do we do that? We draw from these kinds of languages. But I want actually to say something, and then for you to take over the mic as the speaker, because responding to something you said, and in line with what Professor Roodt is saying about finding nuances in these kinds of things that we're saying, or the observations we're making. So you make the point that Lukhanyo Talata has now taken the court because he's seeking justice. At the same time, Lukhanyo meets with the wife of F.W. de Klerk, and Mrs. F.W. de Klerk begs for his forgiveness. And what is the end of that story? They start a relationship, and they call each other. And he says, I call it every time we've had a friendship. I mean, that to me is again this powerful nuance that there is this thing on the one hand that justice must be done in the way that people define justice, but the notion that there is always the potential for forgiveness, or the potential for some kind of transformational vision, the moral imagination. This is a powerful example, I think, for all the reasons that we know about the story of the Kalatas, that here is a son who's been pursuing justice, yet at the same time, there is this potential, the potential possibility for the transformational vision through moral imagination. And I think it's something that we have to always keep in view, that while we recognize all of the contestations, that this notion of the potentiality, what's possible, the possibility that something might shift, that you can't close the door to that possibility because it's also part of the human condition. I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes. I think this isn't a criticism at all, but I think it's strange and symptomatic of how awful the moment is at the moment that we're circulating around the concept of forgiveness. The idea of forgiveness, I can't get the idea of forgiveness and the images of Gaza onto the same page in my mind. There's no way that will work. What did interest me in what you've just said is that with Trump's insane and vicious desire to ethnic cleanse the Palestinians out of Gaza to Egypt and Jordan, and those people, and Egypt and Jordan and other Arab countries systematically refusing to even countenance it, what they're arguing for is, can we find a way to keep the Palestinians on the land they've returned to utterly desolate, completely destroyed? And can they then establish a state in that space which would be a form of viable coexistence? Well, it's very, very clear that the answer of Israel to that is no. I mean, Netanyahu has made it crystal clear that there will be no state. And furthermore, he's talking about this as a war of resurrection of the Jewish people, which I think is really important. I just wanted to say one thing before I talk a little bit more about where I come in relationship to all of this. which is that Hannah Arendt crucially says what matters is that we think what we are doing. I mistranslated that in a book I wrote on violence against women as think about what we are doing. That is so wrong. It's been corrected now in subsequent editions, but not in all of them. And every time I see it, I just squirm in self-embarrassment. Because I think so much hangs on that. Because think about what we're doing is, hey, what do I think about this? And should I do this? And should I do that? But think what we are doing gives the time for the pause. It means maybe you won't do it. So I think there's a huge difference between those two things. What would Arendt have said today? For me, she already said it. She certainly said it in relationship to Zionism. She predicted that Zionism would become an eschatological, mystical, apocalyptic, self-suicide form of national and reinforcement of national identity. And the way she talked about that is it's very close to Gershom Scholem, and crucially their interaction centered around this. Because he went even further and said, is this new nation, in the 30s and 40s he was saying this, is this new nation going to be able to preserve itself when it resurrects from the depth the phantasmagoria of Jewish origins and life? Is it going to be able to resist the apocalyptic dimension of the political imagination? To which the answer has been a categorical no. So those people, if you see some of the people being interviewed on the television sitting outside Gaza, where the devastation is being wrought, these are Israeli Jews who say, we will not be harmed even though we're here because God is protecting us, and we are going to resettle this land. We are going to claim it as it has been biblically delegated to us. I was trying to explain this to my daughter recently. She's just 13. She was getting in a bit of trouble. And she said, do they believe in God or what? I said, it's very simple. Ben-Gurion said, we don't believe in God. He gave us the land. And that is the nugget, which is leading, I think, to the horror. And I've got a few quotes here from Arendt, which are so remarkable about what is happening now. So she said, behind this spurious optimism, this is Arendt, lurks a despair of everything and a genuine readiness for suicide that can become extremely dangerous should they grow to be the mood and atmosphere of Palestinian politics. Omnipotence, what she called impotent bigness, is therefore a false cover for despair. Even at their most ruthless, especially at their most ruthless, the Zionists are carrying into their future a vision of their own doom. So she actually predicted that by plonking themselves in the Middle East, surrounded by enemies who would be hostile to what they would have to do in order to cohere and to establish themselves on the land, they were precipitating a non-tenable position which would lead to eternal belligerence and the eventual destruction of the state itself. No signs of the state destroying itself at the moment, but it is enacting a form of state as violence on a level which, as we've all been saying, we've never quite seen before. So I just wanted to say that there are three, I'll be really brief, but there are three Hannah Arendts for me, where the question isn't what Whitney has said, but what she did say. And the first one is Zionism and the reference to a kind of spiritual yearning which becomes apocalyptic, the apocalyptic sting. That was Gershom Scholem's view of it. And the way, I don't know if you all know this, but there was an incredible exchange. They fell out quite badly around Eichmann in Jerusalem, because Scholem said to her, your book shows no love of the Jewish people. And Arendt said, I don't have love of the Jewish people, not in that way. I don't have love in the way that I do of the people I'm close to and everything. And then she told a story. And the story was an encounter with an unnamed, very famous Israeli politician. It turns out it was Golda Meir. And Golda Meir says, I used to love God, but now I love the Jewish people. And Arendt says, the Jewish people used to be a great people because their love of God was greater than their fear. Now they only love themselves. What good can come out of this? And whenever anybody accuses me of being a self-hating Jew, which happens regularly, as you can imagine, I always say, what kind of Jew do you want me to be? How many of you in this room are parents? Has it never happened to you that you've hated yourself because you behaved so badly around your child? Everybody's hands shot up, right? Kind of, you know, we're all guilty. We're all guilty as parents, without question. So there's something about the capacity for love, which is political as everything else, and as vulnerable and available for misuse, and misuse as national self-love. And that's the tragedy that's unfolding in the Middle East, which is that Israel's self-love is the precondition and the basis of the utter hatred, as Edward Said described like nobody else, the utter hatred and victimization of another people, and they're inseparable. And I feel we're just watching that gap that she opened up in her thinking get broader and broader by the day. The other two things which I think are where she would have been saying it now is an aspect of her work which I was completely amazed to find, actually, which was her engagement with totalitarianism's manipulation of what I will risk calling the psyche. The way, the compulsion with which we compel ourselves was one of her expressions, that we have a tendency to identify politically in a way that brooks no argument. So I love what you said about freedom to become our crutches. But there are certain kinds of belief, totalitarian belief precisely, where there is no room for mobility whatsoever, and you touch on aspects of the psyche which are close to hallucinatory. So I was very interested to hear Jaco end with Melanie Klein and reparation, on which we could have a long discussion. But of course, the most important thing about Melanie Klein is she pushes Freud aside in the kind of graphic, violent, colourful, terrifying snuff movie version of what an infant psyche is all about. You know, so, you know, my students, when I teach Melanie Klein, say, I really can't stand this. No, we can't do this. We can't do this. And then one or two will come and see me and say, supposing she's right. So I've been amazed to see, thinking about it for today, the extent to which Arendt talks about the inner craziness of political life. In fact, it was Socrates who said nobody is sane in public affairs. And it was Ernest Jones who said once that you can treat everybody's sex life as analysis. What you will never touch is their political people. You can never budge them, which I thought was a bit depressing. But there you go. Okay, the third thing I wanted to mention was the notion of power and impotence and false mastery, which has been spoke about. And I was very struck recently by the distinction she makes between Verstand and Vernunft. Yes. And one is the need to know, and the other one is the desire to think. And what's crucial about the desire to think is that it never takes control of its object. It never succumbs to false mastery, which is always fraudulent, because there's no end or beginning. She says in one point, she says, man enacts false mastery, especially man, she's saying, especially the dominus in the Greek family home, because he does not know where he came from before he was born or where he will go when he dies. This is so relevant to COVID. This is so relevant to the sucking of Fauci and the refusal to give him any kind of protection whatsoever, so he could just be shot down because of his position on vaccinations. And crucially, it was central in the first election of Trump, him ripping off his COVID mask after he had COVID. It's a claim for a potency with no fragility, none of the ice breaking that you talked about. It's what she calls at one point impotent bigness. And I'll end with that because I love that phrase so much, impotent bigness. It means that basically power is exerted when it knows it's fraudulent and has no control over itself. I'll just end with this. I once was in conversation with my stepfather, and I just was watching Maxwell or Murdoch or Branson, I can't remember which one, doing something absolutely outrageous. And I just said, although we disagree politically on everything, but I just said, why do people go on accumulating wealth past the point it can be of any use to them whatsoever? What do they want it for? He said two things which I think are brilliant. He said they want it, first of all, because they only feel powerful in the moment of accumulation. When they're not accumulating, they secondly, they want it because they know they can't take it with them. It's a slap in the face of mortality, which is why we had those guys in Silicon Valley saying they were going to set up these factories and these centers in order to produce the elixir of life, to make death a long lost memory. can't be a coincidence at a time when death had never been so much on everybody's front door. These guys start trying to go off up into space, do spaceships and tourism, and found the elixir and the answer to life. Arendt, that was Verstand, and it was impotent bigness. And as you can imagine, there's a lot to be said about impotent bigness and feminism. But I won't go there for now. Anyway, I said enough, and I'm sorry it was all a bit muddled. My notes were very muddled.
Bigness, topics that you return to over and over again in your latest book, right?
Impotent bigness, yeah, it's a refrain.
Yeah, it's a refrain. Yeah. You want to say? Look, I give you a chance, and then I want to give the audience a chance. You have a chance to want to take a chance to respond to Jacqueline.
Maybe I just want to punctuate, I suppose, and say that, perhaps Melanie Klein is, the analyst who thought without a banister. The analyst who thought without a banister, or analyzed without a banister, and that banister was, very strong, very powerful.
Except she was so rigid in her. There was no dissent in the Kleinian circle. And the Kleinians are known, in London at least, to be the ones that can't be argued with.
Exactly.
And I've always thought there was a relationship between the horrible mess that she so lyrically and bravely describes and the rigidity of the Kleinian faction. Because that's the only condition under which you can tolerate that stuff. You've got to get the banisters back up, otherwise you're going to slide down. Yes, very fair.
I wonder what you would say to. I'm just curious now that you raised this issue about how Kleinian theory now is used to remove psychoanalytic thoughts from the consulting room to the social environments.
It has happened for Jacqueline knows this much more than and much better than I do. But it is, I suppose, the dominant form in which psychoanalysis came to politics.
Yeah, I mean the debates in the very early years in the 1940s, those early psychoanalytic conferences where these issues were debated very strongly. But how it's returning now so powerfully, so visibly through these conferences again, and how they're diversifying and bringing it into conversation, interdisciplinary thoughts.
I think there's so many. I think it's fascinating, but I think there are so many different ways this can go. And the way it socialized itself, Kleinianism, as far as I understand it, is very much through the concept of reparation. And as Stephen Frosch has pointed out, he's the one that psychosocial studies person. The concept of reparation comes up between the two wars in psychoanalysis. And the concept of reparation, of course, is what led, more or less, I'm exaggerating, to World War II. It was the war reparations inflicted on Germany and the humiliation of the nation. So the idea of reparation is seen as both absolutely central for getting out of the paranoid schizoid position into the depressive position. But some people, amongst whom I think I'd include myself, think that is a conservative reading of Klein, because it makes the end point too clear.
Easy and clear.
Just in the same way as Arendt said, Eichmann should not be forgiven, because he was deciding who should live on the earth, who had the right to live on the earth, but he lost his right to live on the earth. So, sorry.
Vasti, you want to say before we open it to the floor?
So I'm not. My background is not in psychoanalysis, so I'm sort of going back to something that one of the three things that you picked out on Arendt, which to me is, for me, one of the core ideas, positions of Arendt that I also find been influenced by a lot, and that is how you think about, and Kupano is sitting there because we've had lots of disagreements about this, love and politics, and in that quote of I think it isn't that debate with Gary Michel, where she says something like, I don't love people, I love only my friends. And the danger of love, or at least the wrong kind of love, entering into politics, because the the point that I ended with in my opening statement was, so what is political thinking? Political thinking is concerned with the world between us, not with our individual place within it, and not with this sort of warm feeling that you have towards the people you love. It's colder.
So I'll just take this chance. I know that I said to the audience, but the issue of love is something that you make me think of that debate between her and James Baldwin. The kind of where she says, you can't even bring love to the conversation about healing the racial tensions. And so isn't that, again, another contradiction in the way that she invites us to think about, the possibility of starting again, right? Natality.
Yeah, that was beautiful. That's crucial, isn't it?
And yet, that debate with James Baldwin, where she after the Letters in the Region of My Mind, where she says, how do you talk about love as a response to this tension? And yet there she is, at the same time, inserting the possibility of loving in a different way, which is what I think that the proposition of love as repair or as a reparative, is there something that one can say about that?
10 minutes.
Okay, last word, and then we'll have another 10 minutes.
I can say one thing about love. Arendt is about love. It's Amorundi, love of the world.
Yes,
That's different from love of the self and love of other people. Yeah. So she is motivated by love, but it's love of a common world.
Yes, please. Yes.
Which is that, it does strike me that it is a bit ironic that, affect is all over the politics and the political, but somehow we want to bracket out love as if, the political is not already,
about
clearly, effective in other ways. So why is it necessary to then, bracket out love if we are not prepared at all? And even if politics is founded upon, anger and rage.
Other emotions. Okay, so clearly another event. Clearly. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah. You'll be the keynote.
Should go on for another few hours. But thank you very much.
We'll have 10 more minutes. He says yes.
Well, could I cut to the chase and be a bit provocative and suggest, given this concept of banality of evil and how powerful it's been for thinking about all sorts of disciplines and so on, perhaps Arendt would see Gaza as the Auschwitz of the moment. And it's not Eichmann that she's watching, it's the reasonable liberal, Blinken, or whoever. It could be anybody. Could be people at this university who seem to suggest that the ICJ ruling was, many people say, no, it's legally, it has no legs, and it's pure emotion, it's partisanship. But actually, as it's played out, those arguments are less strong. So what I'm saying, the thoughtlessness of a liberal, and I'm probably a liberal, sometimes I think I'm left, but the point is, it requires such self-interrogation. It's not an Eichmann in the dark right now. It's how the West, very big category, watched in real time and couldn't speak, couldn't say anything, with all the apparatus of the post-Holocaust jurisprudence of international humanitarian law and all the rest that you could tell. This whole infrastructure was there, and yet there was silence. And even now, there's still, so it's
rationalization.
Yeah. So the reason is the problem.
Legally. An occupying power does not legally have the right to self-defense.
Yeah.
So Israel goes on justifying it.
But there's a failure, and it's not the easy story of Eichmann in the dark. It requires a real confrontation with what happened and what is still happening.
Yeah, and maybe this is actually the role of scholars, because again, I mean, Hannah Arendt, Ahmed in Jerusalem, and how her book became a touchstone for all these debates, about totalitarianism, about evil, our response to evil, witnessing. I mean, the whole language of bearing witness actually began around that time. Bearing witness, she was bearing witness, and then there was the movies, the films. It is about how do scholars then pick up these kinds of conversations and build a new language of speaking about these issues, about bearing witness, which in a way this discussion is hoping to do that, because I mean, again, Nazism, the Holocaust, all of these are implicated in these discussions, and in Hannah Arendt's own beginning of thinking, it started with a response to Nazism and to the Holocaust. And so now, as you really say, I like that idea of, Gaza is the Auschwitz of today, is our Auschwitz today. Such a powerful observation.
That's what Pankaj Mishra says in his book. And people read Pankaj Mishra's book. So
Read the essay.
it's sort of the argument.
Okay, let's take two at the same time, two comments, points, questions from the audience, whatever is on your heart. In this room, nothing is out of bounds. So we say this all the time. There you go. Yes.
I'm thinking a lot about what has been said with relationship to also what Prof. Jaco has said as a long-standing student of his. He knows this personally. But thinking about this idea of thinking, again, maybe I'll say it in a very juvenile sense, but thinking without bounds, and also your thoughts around how we can engage with repairing the irreparable through the poetic, and again, for me, thinking again about how we salvage the poetic from this kind of, this niceness. I don't have language. This kind of, when we think about when we think about the poetic that way, but when we think about the poetic as much more critical, as much more as something that can peep into the obscene and want to make sense on the obscene. And I think sometimes I'm borrowing your language and thinking that if we're going to think about without bounds in that case, and using the poetic as a position or as a gesture, then we must not only use it in that other way, when someone says the poetic, we think about it that way, but also as something that can actually peep into the obscene, yeah.
It feels like that question requires. Maybe let's take your question as well. Yeah.
It's a general question, and I kind of wrote it out this morning. I knew I would forget it, but it actually kind of pertains to the discussion we've had, and I've also not necessarily framed Hannah Arendt as being central in this, but actually located it within sort of the critical tradition that she was responding to. And one of the things I just want to suggest is that we're not only seeing a return to fascism in a kind of global sense, maybe a big turn to the right, but also a kind of inability to work through the precarity and incompleteness of the human condition. So this idea that we are actually returning to a very theological, anti-scientific age. I framed it like this. So Michel Foucault warns that the fascism that we must be most vigilant against is rooted in our own desire for power, a power that operates not only through institutions, but within the very structures of thought. For Foucault, this Western compulsion can be traced back to the problem of nihilism and the death of God, where modern ethics risk replicating the metaphysical authority of God through the figure of man. So thinkers like Sylvia Wynter extend this critique by linking the construction of man to the colonial project and planetary crises. So this is sort of like big impotence in a sense. So I said, drawing from this and moving towards Slavoj Zizek's claim that radical democratic practice depends on accepting the absence of a ground of being. How might we understand the ongoing psychocultural crises in the West as repeated attempts to restore ontological certainty through totalizing concepts such as race, nation, and a Christianized nationalism? So what accounts for the persistent inability to work through nihilism as a problem related to cultural trauma, particularly when this cultural trauma seems to manifest in a backlash against any form of scientific authority, and resort back to the worst forms of traditionalism? And how might this failure contribute to the broader threat of planetary survival and the future of democratic possibility? So that was...
Thank you to you both. So I'm going to leave those questions for you. There's one that clearly directed at you, and then we'll move into the next.
Is there time to answer?
Yeah. We see they've allowed 10 more minutes.
I mean, I think, there's a number of different answers. So I will just say two things. The first is that, I think this is precisely a time to read the poets, and I think that the Palestinian poets are to be read now as witnesses of the moment that has lasted for a very long time, I think. So in that sense, yes, we need poetry. So that's one thing. But then I think the poetic, more broadly, as this kind of what you call peeping into the obscene, I think is there. But I also think that one must seize upon the sense of the poetic as creative, as a creative intervention. And it is a creative intervention that, that is fundamentally signifying. It is an intervention into signification and what the possibilities of signification. But, we didn't have to, have Lacan go on and on about the materiality of signification, the ways in which language distributes matter, and what matters. And that dimension, I think, creative intervention into precisely the distribution of the material, the redistribution of the material, and of what matters is really, critical at this point. And what we are seeing is precisely the opposite of that.
Thank you, Jaco. Any takers for Herman?
Could I say just one small thing in response to the second question? So it's not a direct response to your question. It is maybe nuancing a little bit. So we tend to think we are in a time of crisis. That's not wrong. We are. We are not in a unique time of crisis. Right? Go back 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, throw a dart at a map, and you'll find the drive for, you would find impotent bigness, drive for mastery. So just to say that there is not some kind of great historical impetus that has pushed us towards a unique crisis now that the world has not known before. And it may help to reflect on how previous crises were responded to.
Yes, Herman.
Really, thank you. This is so stimulating. I want to pick up on something that Jaco said. I really like the idea of your point about the spectacular banality. I mean, the way that banality has become spectacular. And now, as a media scholar, I'm interested in the role of the media in this sort of spectacularity. And I wonder, and that leads me to my sort of question maybe to everybody is and also picking up on the notion of the poetic. What is the role of scholars and poets and creatives? Because what is the difference between witnessing and spectating? The idea of, I'm reminded of Baudrillard, it says the Gulf War didn't happen. The idea that this simulacrum, and this to the extent that we are so overwhelmed almost by this sort of spectating of this. And so what is our response as scholars and creatives and poets, and what does this, recognizing that the banality has become so spectacular, well, how do we resist it in a way that it becomes, I don't know if it becomes less spectacular, but more impactful in a way that it arrests us.
But how do we respond? Because when you do respond, there is a counter response that sort of silences the response.
Because there's a very deliberate,
Yeah.
very deliberate banality, right? The idea of wokeness, for instance, or often thrown out because you think too much, right? There's too much criticism, there's too much thinking. So more thinking is probably not going to be, more sort of critical thinking is not the response, but some other way, some other mode of engagement.
Of acting, is that where you are taking this?
Yeah, I mean, how do we as scholars respond in a way that cannot be dismissed by the banality, because the banality has become the sort of powerful discourse, the banality, the spectacle of the ordinary, or the banality has become powerful, has become a commodity, as you said.
I think Jacqueline is best positioned to answer that.
I don't think there's going to be an answer to that. But critical thinking has never been so under assault. And another person I've really been affected by in the last few years has been Simone Weil. And she says over and over again about the obligation to think and the freedom to think and the way you can be charting your own oppression, but you still have that freedom. Like Iago saying to Othello, "What would you have me speak? What even a slave does not have to speak thereof, utter my thoughts." I, the villain of the play, is the one who speaks the language of the freedom of the slave. It's an extraordinary moment. But I would just want to say that the capacity to go on thinking in terms of, for example, Adania Shibli, I mean, read the Palestinian poets and writers, Adania Shibli's Meine Diet, withdrawn from the prize, the Deutsche Prize, or whatever prize it was, and the number of public discussions that are being shut down across Germany in relationship to this, because Germany's got itself into such a knicker twist over this obligation towards Israel, so-called, and what it's allowing it to do to its dissenters. So I think, not to take this as an example, but obviously Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela's work is crucial in bridging the line between thought and activism, memory and justice. And we need as much of that as possible so that people feel they still have the right to question. Because the dominance of neoliberal thinking at the moment, I'm from the UK, and watching Starmer announce all the houses he's going to build on floodlands, and watching, the fact that the AstraZeneca vaccination centre, he offered less to the firm than the Conservative Party did, so they've withdrawn the project, and listening to Rachel Reeves go on about growth, sounding like Liz Truss, you just want to say, excuse me, growth is not a good thing. Right? I mean, it is really homogenizing certain almost religious investment in neoliberal discourse. You challenge it wherever you can. That's what I would say. And that's not a satisfactory answer, but it's what everybody in this room, I suspect, feels they're trying to do one way or another. So huge thanks to Pumla for being who she is and creating this space.
Last words, I think. This is the last word, because there's time.
Yeah, I think then I must have.
No, please do. Yes, please, yeah. She's going to speak tomorrow. So she has the last.
Get another
Back to Herman's question, and the one thought I had about that is, so what can one do to resist the banality of the spectacle? And seems to me that the spectacle is also often without memory. Huh? It is the spectacle of the moment, and then moving on to the next, and moving on to the next. So one way of resisting is to remember, and that is what journalists do, right? Not only, but I mean, thinkers in society is to keep the memory alive. What happened last week, last year, a century ago, 2 centuries ago? That's a form of.
Your Arendt has that wonderful phrase, organized remembrance.
Organized, that is what a society is. A polity.
Thank you so much. That was a great way to end the conversation. Thank you so much to our speakers.